What if the question, why are we here, wasn't just a philosophical musing, but a clue to the very fabric of reality? The book titled, very intriguingly, Why, dares to suggest that purpose isn't just a human longing, but a quality built into the very nature of things. Prepare for a journey that explores a conscious universe, hinting at a cosmic purpose far more intriguing than you ever imagined. Join us as we unpack this mind-bending vision and perhaps, just perhaps, find a new sense of belonging in our world. But before we start, hit that like button and subscribe so you can keep up with our journey of exploration. Even better, hit that notification bell so the algorithm doesn't choose for you, but you can choose what content to consume. Okay, let's get into it.
Okay, so have you ever had this burning question, like something so big it kind of makes your head spin? You want to get to the bottom of it, but you don't want to spend years reading a ton of boring textbooks?
Yeah, totally.
That's exactly what we're doing in this deep dive. And we're not just skimming the surface here. We're going all in on a question that's been puzzling philosophers and scientists and pretty much everyone who's ever looked up at the stars and wondered, what's it all about? Why does the universe even exist?
And the stuff you sent us, it's like a roadmap to some really wild ideas.
Right.
We'll be digging into this book, Why? The Purpose of the Universe by Philip Goff. And just look at the names who are praising this book. Philip Pullman, Michael Ty, Donald Hoffman.
Yeah, you got some serious philosophical heavyweights.
When these guys are impressed, it's got to be good.
It's not just good, it's mind-blowing. We're talking about potentially cracking the ultimate code of reality. So consider this our mission. We're going to take these complex ideas and try to make them clear. We're going to connect the dots in ways you might not expect.
And hopefully have some fun along the way.
Right. Because why should exploring the universe be boring? And by the end of this, we're hoping you'll have this awe-inspiring sense of the universe. That it's even more wondrous and mysterious than you thought.
Totally.
So to get started, we're going to be drawing from all sorts of sources. Cutting-edge science, deep philosophical thought. We'll touch on morality, even the bizarre world of consciousness.
That's like a plan.
So let's start at the very beginning, with the most basic question a human can ask. Why? It's the question that drives everything.
Absolutely.
I mean, think about it. A little kid asking, why is the sky blue? Scientists trying to figure out how the universe works. Theologians pondering the nature of God.
It's all driven by this fundamental need to understand, to know why things are the way they are.
Exactly. And what's so cool about this book is that it suggests this desire for purpose might not just be some human quirk. Maybe purpose is actually baked into the fabric of the universe.
That's a radical idea, isn't it?
Yeah.
That the meaning isn't something we invent, but something that's actually out there.
It totally flips the script. It's not us searching for meaning in a meaningless void, but the meaning is already there. And the author even connects this to something so personal, like that feeling every new parent has, that anxiety of bringing a child into a world that's so full of problems, that question of what's the point of it all?
Oh, yeah, I remember that feeling. It's heavy.
It is. But if there's a bigger cosmic purpose at play, then maybe our lives, all the struggles and joys, all the little things we do, they contribute to something bigger.
Right, like every action we take could ripple outwards and have this cosmic significance. We're all part of this vast unfolding story.
And the book even brings in some historical figures who pondered this idea of a universe with a direction, like Teilhard de Chardin.
Oh yeah, de Chardin. He was a Jesuit priest and a paleontologist. Fascinating guy. He saw the universe as this process of evolution that's ultimately heading towards a point of complete unity in consciousness. He called it the Omega point.
And there's another guy, right? Samuel Alexander.
Yeah, Alexander. He's a philosopher. And he came up with a very similar idea, this inherent drive in the universe towards greater complexity and higher states of being. He called it Nisus. And what's interesting is that both these guys, one religious, one not, they both pointed towards this idea of an intrinsic purpose in the cosmos, a directionality.
Okay, so we've got this mind-blowing idea of inherent cosmic purpose.
Right.
But then the book takes this really interesting detour into right and wrong.
Morality.
Yeah. And it reminds me of when I was a teenager. You know how you go through that phase where you think morality is all relative? Whatever feels right to you is right.
Oh, yeah, I was totally there. In fact, the author shares this funny story about how he embraced moral subjectivism as a teen and ended up bleaching his hair. Just to kind of prove a point, I guess.
I love that.
Yeah, it's a common thing. This belief that good and bad are just a matter of opinion or cultural norms. You hear it a lot in those late-night college dorm debates.
Oh, totally. But then the book introduces this idea of moral objectivism, the idea that there are some things that are just plain wrong. regardless of what anyone thinks.
Exactly, like the slave trade. It's hard to argue that that wasn't objectively morally wrong no matter what the cultural norms were at the time.
It makes you really question this whole idea of relative morality. And the book mentions Jonathan Dancy as someone who really champions this view of objective moral truths.
Yeah, Dancy's a contemporary moral philosopher. He argues that there are moral reasons that exist independently of our desires or beliefs. Fascinating stuff.
It is. And what's cool is how the author's own journey with this question of objective morality led him to this really interesting philosophical puzzle, something called the is-ought gap.
The is-ought gap. That's a classic philosophical problem. It was first pointed out by the philosopher David Hume.
And I gotta admit, when I first heard about this is-ought gap, I was like, what is that, some kind of sci-fi thing?
It sounds kind of intimidating, but it's actually a pretty straightforward idea. Hume basically said you can't logically jump from statements about facts, what is, to statements about values, what ought to be.
So just because something is a certain way, it doesn't mean it should be that way?
Right, like just because people sometimes lie doesn't mean it's morally okay to lie.
Got it.
And this is where things get really interesting, because the author realized there's this tension between the is-ought gap and another idea from Hume, this idea that reason ought to be the slave of the passions. It essentially means that reason should primarily be used to help us achieve our desires. So this tension really made the author question both these ideas from Hume, and it led him down this even darker path into value nihilism.
Ooh, nihilism. Now that's some deep stuff.
It is, and it's not just about saying meaning is subjective. Nihilism takes it a step further. It's the belief that everything we do is ultimately pointless.
So all our efforts to make the world a better place, all our striving for knowledge and beauty and all of it, it's all meaningless.
According to nihilism.
What?
Yeah. It's a pretty bleak outlook.
Yeah.
And the book points out how it's actually really hard to live consistently with that belief. Because as humans, we're always making choices. We're weighing reasons, acting as if some things matter more than others.
Yeah, it's like we can't escape this need to find value in things.
Exactly. And the book even connects this sense of meaninglessness to depression, suggesting that if nihilism were true, then maybe depression wouldn't be a disorder, but the only accurate perception.
Whoa, that's heavy. But the author doesn't just leave us in this pit of despair, does he?
No. He offers a glimmer of hope. This idea that there might be a deeper unified story connecting our understanding of mathematical truths and ethical principles.
So maybe the meaning we find in life isn't just some made-up story we tell ourselves.
Exactly. And here's where things take a really unexpected turn, because the book argues that science itself might actually be pointing us back towards purpose.
What? Science? That's surprising.
It is. If you think about the early days of modern science, it actually emerged within a framework of belief in God. Like Isaac Newton, he believed God designed the universe and even had to occasionally nudge the planets to keep things running smoothly.
Right, like God was this cosmic watchmaker.
Exactly. But as science advanced, people like Laplace came along and showed how you could explain the solar system without needing God. He famously said, "I have no need of that hypothesis," when asked about God's role.
So it seemed like science was making God unnecessary.
Right. And then you had thinkers like William Paley. He came up with his famous watchmaker analogy. He said, just like finding a complex watch implies a watchmaker, the incredible complexity and design we see in living things implies an intelligent designer.
But then Darwin came along and shook things up again with his theory of evolution.
Right. Natural selection became the new watchmaker, a blind watchmaker that could create complexity without needing a conscious designer.
So for a long time, it seemed like science had pushed purpose and design out of the picture.
It did. But here's the mind-blowing twist. Contemporary physics has stumbled upon this thing called the fine-tuning of the universe.
Yeah, and when I first heard about fine-tuning, I was like, wait, what?
It's kind of hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah.
But basically, imagine all the fundamental constants of physics. These are the unchangeable numbers that govern how the universe works at its most basic level. Things like the strength of gravity or the masses of particles like quarks and electrons.
Okay, got it.
Now, here's the thing. It turns out that if these constants were even slightly different, the universe as we know it wouldn't exist.
Like how slightly different?
Like unbelievably slightly different. In some cases, changing them by even a tiny fraction would lead to a universe where stars and galaxies and planets and life could never form.
Whoa. Can you give me some examples to really drive this home?
Sure. Take the mass of the down quark. If it were just 3 times heavier, the universe would be filled with only hydrogen. no other elements.
So no carbon, no oxygen, no us.
Exactly. Or look at the electric charge of the electron. If it were slightly different, stars wouldn't be able to create heavier elements. Again, no life. It's like the universe is balanced on a knife's edge.
It's mind-blowing. It just seems way too precise to be an accident.
Right. And that's where this idea of the value selection hypothesis comes in.
Okay, break down the value selection hypothesis for me.
Basically, we've got two options. Either the fine-tuning is just a colossal cosmic coincidence, like the universe just happened to win the lottery on a scale that's unimaginable, or these constants are the way they are because they allow for a universe that contains value, a universe with life, consciousness, complexity, all that good stuff.
So the laws of physics are tilted towards creating a universe that's actually interesting.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
And the book tries to show how truly mind-bogglingly improbable this fine-tuning is. Imagine rolling a die 70 times and getting a 6 every single time. The odds of that are astronomical.
Like winning the lottery 70 times in a row?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
But the odds of the universe being fine-tuned for life are way, way smaller than that. So if we wouldn't accept 76s in a row as just random chance, can we really dismiss the fine-tuning of the universe as just a fluke?
It seems like a bit of a stretch. So the author defines cosmic purpose as any hypothesis where goal-directedness plays a fundamental role in the universe. And the value selection hypothesis is one form of cosmic purpose.
Exactly. And the evidence for fine-tuning becomes evidence for some form of cosmic purpose.
It's like there's this inherent directionality in the universe, this tendency towards creating something meaningful.
Right. It's not something that just pops up with life. It's woven into the fabric of reality itself.
Oh, okay, now my brain's starting to hurt a little. How do we even think about evidence and probability when we're talking about the whole universe? It's like trying to wrap my head around infinity.
Uh-huh. It's a good question. And the book dives into this in its digging deeper section. It uses something called Bayes' theorem. But don't worry, we're not going to get lost in equations.
Thank goodness.
The basic idea is pretty simple. To figure out if some evidence supports a theory, you got to compare how likely the evidence would be if the theory were true versus how likely it would be if the theory were false.
So it's all about comparison.
Yeah. It's not just about how weird the evidence is on its own. It's about which story makes the evidence more probable.
I like that. A story.
Right. So imagine a detective finds Joan's DNA at a crime scene. That evidence supports the theory that Joan did it if it's more likely to find her DNA there if she's the culprit than if she's innocent.
So it's like if you find a bunch of rocks on the beach arranged to spell out love, life, love the moment, it's a very specific arrangement.
Yeah. Any specific arrangement of rocks is improbable. But that particular arrangement is way more likely if someone deliberately placed them there than if they were just randomly scattered by the waves.
Right. It's like the difference between finding a random pile of Legos and finding a fully built Lego Millennium Falcon.
Exactly. So when we apply this to fine-tuning, the evidence that the universe has the precise constants needed for life is way more likely if the value selection hypothesis is true than if it's just a random fluke.
So even though we've only observed one universe, the fact that it's so precisely fine-tuned makes the value selection hypothesis a much better story.
Right. Now, this doesn't necessarily rule out the idea of a multiverse.
Right.
There might be countless universes out there with different constants.
Yeah.
But even then, we still need to explain why at least some of those universes are fine-tuned for life.
Okay, so we've got fine-tuning and the value selection hypothesis. But what about the anthropic principle? Doesn't that kind of explain away the improbability of us being here?
Yeah, the book addresses that too. It uses this cool analogy by John Leslie. Imagine you're facing a firing squad of 50 expert marksmen. They all fire. But somehow you survive. You'd think that's insanely lucky.
I'd be freaking out.
Right. But then you realize if they hadn't all missed, you wouldn't be around to even think about it.
True.
So the anthropic principle says we shouldn't be too surprised by the life-sustaining conditions of our universe, because if those conditions weren't there, we wouldn't be here to observe them.
It's like a cosmic survivor bias.
Exactly. But the book points out that the fine-tuning argument is more than just about the fact that we exist. It's about the extremely specific range of constants needed for any kind of complex chemistry in life.
Right, it's not just about humans. It's about the potential for life in general.
Exactly. The anthropic principle explains why we observe these conditions. But it doesn't explain why these conditions are so incredibly specific in the first place.
Okay, so it's like saying the reason you won the lottery is because you bought a ticket. That's true, but it doesn't explain why your ticket had the winning numbers.
Perfect analogy. And the book also talks about different types of probability. There are objective probabilities like those in quantum mechanics, And then there are Bayesian probabilities, which are more about how much confidence we should have in different explanations based on the evidence.
So it's like subjective probability.
Kind of. It's about what's rational to believe given what we know. And the fine-tuning argument relies on this Bayesian type of probability. It's saying that the evidence makes the value selections hypothesis way more likely than the cosmic fluke hypothesis.
Okay, my head's definitely spinning, but in a good way.
It's mind-bending stuff. And the book doesn't stop there. It goes even deeper into the rabbit hole of consciousness.
Oh yeah, consciousness. That's a whole other can of worms.
It is. And the book makes this really interesting point. Our own conscious experience, that feeling of being, is a fundamental piece of data about the universe. But it's something we know directly, not through experiments or observations.
It's like the most basic fact we know, but also the most mysterious.
Exactly. And even if we had this perfect scientific theory that explained every particle and force in the universe, it still wouldn't explain why we have this inner world of experience.
Right. It could describe all the physical processes in our brains, but it wouldn't explain why we feel like something.
It's the so-called hard problem of consciousness. And the book talks about the Turing test. You know how if a machine can convincingly imitate a human in conversation, we might say it's thinking.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
Well, the book introduces this idea of meaning zombies.
Meaning zombies. Are we talking about like The Walking Dead here?
No, not that kind of zombie. A meaning zombie is a hypothetical being that's physically identical to us. It acts just like us. It might even pass the Turing test.
Yeah.
But has no inner experience.
So it's like a perfect imitation, but there's no one home inside?
Yeah, creepy, right?
It's kind of terrifying.
And the question is such a being even possible? Could we all just be super sophisticated robots going through the motions without actually experiencing anything?
That's a chilling thought.
It is. And the book explores different views on this. The standard scientific view is that our behavior is ultimately determined by the laws of physics. Consciousness might be a side effect, but it doesn't actually cause anything.
So it's like our conscious experience is just along for the ride.
That's the idea. But if that's true, then why would evolution have favored consciousness? If our actions are just determined by physics, why bother with this whole inner world of feelings and thoughts?
Yeah, it seems kind of pointless from an evolutionary perspective.
And that's the problem. It's called the meaning zombie problem. If having conscious experience doesn't change our behavior, then evolution wouldn't select for it.
So how do we get around this problem?
The author suggests an interesting solution: Pan-agentialism.
Pan-agentialism. Okay, now that one definitely sounds like it's from a sci-fi novel.
I know, right? But it's a fascinating idea. It basically says that even at the most fundamental level, matter has a kind of proto-agency, a very basic capacity to respond to its own experience.
So even like tiny particles have some kind of rudimentary consciousness.
That's the gist of it. So instead of particles just blindly following physical laws, they have this tiny bit of awareness, and they act in ways that make sense given that awareness.
So even an electron has a tiny bit of like free will.
In a very, very basic sense. And as matter forms more complex structures, this proto-agency evolves and eventually becomes the full-blown consciousness we experience.
So it's like consciousness is built into the fabric of reality from the bottom up.
Exactly. It's not something that just magically appears with brains. It's a fundamental property of the universe.
That's a huge shift from the traditional scientific view where everything is just atoms bumping around.
Right. And it challenges this idea of micro-reductionism, the view that you can explain everything by breaking it down to its smallest parts.
Like if you just look at all the individual parts, you miss the bigger picture.
Exactly. The book uses the analogy of a wild party. You can describe everything each person at the party is doing, but that doesn't capture the overall vibe of the party. There's something more to it than just the sum of its parts.
I like that. And the party analogy makes me think of another point the book makes about this guy called Inverted Ian.
Oh yeah, Inverted Ian.
Yeah.
He's a thought experiment. Imagine someone whose inner experiences are completely mismatched with their behavior. Like they see blue, but they say they see red.
And they act as if they see red.
Exactly. Now, the fact that we don't encounter people like Inverted Ian suggests that there's a connection between our inner experience and our behavior.
Right. If our inner lives were totally disconnected from our actions, the world would be a very strange place.
It would. And it wouldn't make sense for evolution to favor consciousness. So the very fact that we have these consistent experiences suggests that there's a purpose to consciousness. that it plays a role in how we interact with the world.
Okay, so we've got this idea that even tiny particles have this proto-agency and that consciousness is built into the universe from the bottom up.
Yeah.
Now, the book contrasts this with Aristotle's ancient view of a teleological universe, a universe where everything has an inherent purpose.
Right. Aristotle believed that everything in the universe has a final cause, a goal or purpose that it's striving towards.
But then the scientific revolution came along and shifted the focus to mechanism.
Right. The emphasis became on efficient causes.
Yeah.
The physical laws that govern how things work.
So instead of asking why, we started asking how.
Exactly. But Pan-agentialism offers a way to bridge these two views. It suggests that purpose in the sense of this fundamental rational responsiveness might be built into the universe itself without needing a god to impose those purposes from outside.
So it's like the universe has this inherent drive towards greater complexity and consciousness.
That's one way to think about it. And this brings us to the always tricky question of free will.
Free will. Ugh, that one always makes my brain hurt.
The book briefly discusses different perspectives on free will, like compatibilism, which says free will and determinism can coexist.
So even if our actions are ultimately determined, we can still have free will.
That's the compatibilist view.
But isn't that a bit contradictory?
Some people think so. The book also mentions Galen Strawson, who argues that we're not truly free because we don't get to choose our desires or our basic nature.
So we're not the authors of our own selves.
That's Strawson's point. But the book leans towards the libertarian view of free will. This is the idea that our choices aren't predetermined, but are genuine acts of choosing based on our reasons and desires.
So we have real agency.
Yeah. And the book addresses a common objection to libertarian free will, this idea that it must just mean our choices are random.
Well, if they're not determined by prior causes, then what else could they be?
The book argues that our choices are based on our reasons and desires. But those reasons and desires don't force us to choose in a particular way.
It's like we can weigh different options and make a conscious decision.
Exactly. And as Wittgenstein said, explanations have to stop somewhere.
You can't keep asking why forever.
Right. At some point, you reach the fundamental level of choice.
Okay, so we've explored purpose, fine-tuning, consciousness, free will, but we can't talk about the purpose of the universe without addressing the elephant in the room, right? The problem of evil.
Yeah, the amount of suffering in the world is a huge challenge to any idea of a benevolent cosmic purpose.
Or a benevolent God.
Right. The book tackles this head on. It discusses some traditional theological arguments, like Swinburne's idea that natural evil is necessary for us to learn about good and evil.
And that suffering can help us develop virtues like compassion and resilience.
Yeah, that's the classic soul-making argument. But the author presents some really interesting counter-arguments. He uses these thought experiments like the Great Discovery and the Daring Rescue to question why a supposedly perfect being would need to create suffering for these purposes.
Right. Like, why not just create us with those virtues already built in?
Exactly. And this leads to what the book calls the cosmic sin intuition. It's this deep feeling that it would be morally wrong for an all-powerful being to intentionally create a universe with so much pain and suffering.
Like it would be a cosmic sin.
Exactly. The book uses the analogy of that Black Mirror episode where they create a simulated world full of suffering just for entertainment.
Yeah, that episode was messed up.
It was. And it makes you question, would we as moral beings ever do something like that?
I don't think so.
Right. It seems wrong.
So where does that leave us with the idea of a designer?
The book explores some unconventional designer hypotheses, like the evil designer hypothesis.
So the universe was created by an evil being.
That's the idea. But as the book points out, this runs into its own problems. Like, why is there so much good in the world if the designer is truly evil?
Yeah, it's like the problem of good.
Exactly. And the book also criticizes these overly broad design hypotheses, the ones that are so vague they can explain anything.
Which means they actually explain nothing.
Right. But the book does present one designer hypothesis that's more interesting, the value-responsive designer.
Okay, tell me about that one.
This is the idea that the designer's motivations were aligned with creating a universe that could support value. So it's not just about creating life, but about creating a universe where good things can happen.
Okay, that makes more sense. But are there ways to think about cosmic purpose without needing a designer at all?
The book explores that too. It discusses the possibility of teleological laws.
Teleological laws.
Yeah. These are laws of nature that have an inherent goal-directedness built into them.
So it's like the universe is naturally inclined to move in a certain direction.
That's the idea. And then there's the even more radical idea of a conscious universe.
Well, hold on. A conscious universe, like the universe is one giant thinking being.
That's the idea behind teleological cosmopsychism. It's a pretty wild concept, but it could potentially explain both the fine-tuning and the existence of consciousness.
Okay, I'm going to need a minute to process that one.
Take your time. It's a lot to take in. But it does connect back to our earlier discussion about consciousness. The book talks about David Chalmers' thought experiment about uploading someone's mind to a computer.
Oh, yeah.
This is often used to argue that consciousness isn't tied to biological brains, that it could exist in different physical substrates.
So, like, we could have conscious AI.
Exactly. But the pan-agentialist perspective offers a counter-argument. It suggests that consciousness probably does make a difference to behavior. So a simulated brain might not have the same kind of genuine consciousness as a real one.
So even if we could perfectly copy a brain, it wouldn't necessarily be conscious.
That's the argument.
Yeah.
And while physicist Sabine Hassenfelder criticizes panpsychism based on the success of standard physics, the book points out that Russellian panpsychism isn't trying to add anything new to physics. It's offering a more fundamental story about the nature of reality.
So it's like saying consciousness is the ground floor of existence.
Yeah, and that the physical world emerges from consciousness. Of course, this raises all sorts of questions, like how do all these tiny bits of consciousness combine to form a unified consciousness?
Yeah, that's a big one.
Called the combination problem. But the book suggests some possible solutions, like the idea of partial reduction, where our complex experiences are somehow inherited from these fundamental levels of consciousness.
Okay, my brain is officially fried, but in a good way.
It's mind-expanding stuff. And as we wrap up, the book turns towards this really hopeful vision of the future. It calls it cosmic purposivism.
Cosmic purposivism. Sounds kind of epic.
It is. It's this idea that our ethical responsibility goes beyond just fixing problems. We should be actively contributing to the creation of a better future, and even the next stage of cosmic evolution.
So we're not just passengers, we're active participants in the unfolding of the universe.
That's the idea. And the book touches on this idea of spiritual advancement as a process of breaking through our limitations and accessing deeper levels of consciousness.
So like having mystical experiences.
Yeah. And it references William James, who argued that we shouldn't dismiss these experiences just because they're hard to explain scientifically.
Makes sense.
And the author even shares his own personal journey with religion, moving away from rigid beliefs towards a more liberal understanding, focused on community, tradition, and ritual, even without necessarily believing everything literally.
So it's like finding meaning in religion, even if you don't take all the dogma literally.
Exactly. And it highlights the importance of community and the growing trend of being spiritual but not religious.
I think a lot of people can relate to that.
Yeah, for sure. And finally, the book makes this really important point. It says, the idea that science has ruled out cosmic purpose is actually a misconception.
So we've been wrong this whole time.
Well, not necessarily wrong. But we've been looking at things too narrowly. We've been focusing on what we can observe and measure while neglecting the inner world of consciousness.
So we need to expand our view of what science can tell us.
Exactly. And when we do that, the possibility of cosmic purpose becomes a lot more plausible.
Okay, whoa. That was an incredible journey. We went from the fundamental why to the mysteries of consciousness, the problem of evil, and even a glimpse into the future of cosmic evolution.
It's a lot to take in.
It is, but it's so mind-blowing. I feel like my understanding of the universe has been completely transformed.
Me too.
And I really hope you listening are feeling the same way. Because if the universe does have this inherent tendency towards value and consciousness, as the book argues, it really changes everything. It changes how we think about our lives and the future we're creating. So keep pondering these big questions. And if you enjoyed this deep dive and you want to explore more mind-bending ideas with us, hit that like button and subscribe. We've got so much more to explore together.
We do.
So until next time, keep looking up at the stars and keep wondering.
And keep those burning questions coming.
We'll see you in the next deep dive.